Before this video starts, I want to quickly mention that this was initially a 1 hour video, but what I've done is I've decided to split it up into 3 separate parts. That way it's a little bit more digestible to watch and it's a little bit more easier so that you don't have to focus for over an hour. The following videos after that will pretty much continue on from where it left off. So enjoy the video. On your screen right now, you're seeing a bunch of numbers. These numbers don't mean anything to you, but for me, they mean absolutely everything, especially when it comes to Turtle Trial. These numbers represent all of the lines of code within the scripts that I've done for Turtle Trial. In total, there are 20,532 lines of code. That's a lot of code for a game as simple as Turtle Trial. That is a total of 154 scripts. Now I'm making this video because I should have made it a little bit earlier than I've done now. I feel like it's a good time to look back on Turtle Trial, which was our first released game. Now before I go into the coding, let's look at some of the details of Turtle Trial. So for those of you who haven't seen Turtle Trial or haven't seen any videos on this channel, then you won't really know what Turtle Trial is. Well, it's actually just a little top-down game where you explore and try and complete your story, your objective, which is usually to collect a certain amount of items, build up your abilities, unlock skills and abilities to help you progress until you complete the story and fight a boss at the end. I released this game on the 24th of February 2020. So that was last year. So as I mentioned, we're well over a year now, and so this is a perfect time to come back to it. And with this release came a same release, not just on the Windows Store, but also released on itch.io. I released it on itch.io as well because it was planned to be free, and it has a bit more of an open community when it comes to looking at free games and games that are still in development. itch.io is the same website, same community that I post my free games on that are still in development, and places where I do game jams to try and improve. And so people there are very open to playing games even if they're broken or very buggy. So it was a perfect place to release a free game to get a little bit of feedback on. So the whole reason I uploaded on Windows though, and became available not just on PC but on consoles, was more of a test to try and see how many people would play it, how many people would be willing to try it out, and also a way for me to know how you actually get a game on console, and just the experience of actually releasing a game. Same release on both platforms as well as on console, and it was developed under the name TNG1701GB. It was published by me with only a small amount of size, so it was absolutely brilliant to play if you didn't have much space on either your PC or your console. The basic description I have is you're a turtle who's lost, needs to escape this certain area. You had the Lost Ocean Path, which was essentially a mission, which I called a Turtle Trial, hence the name. But there's also a second one on release which was a bit buggy and was actually a sort of add-on, which was changed later. I'll talk about that in a minute, in a lot more detail. However, this was ultimately, of course, free. Let's actually go into the code, because that's what this video is all about. As I mentioned when we started, these are all lines of code, number of lines of code within each script. Some of them are extreme, like over 300 plus, and some of them are quite low. For now, I'm just going to talk about the really important ones that are over something like 300 lines of code. I'll talk about those ones individually, because I didn't really cover much code in Turtle Trial towards the end. Now when I'm talking about the code, it's going to split up into 2 parts. The first one is the main Turtle Trial game, and then we'll talk about the later expansion Frozen Chains update. Now the way this is going to work is I'm going to talk about only scripts that had over 300 lines of code. That meant that they were quite complex, and usually would rely on other scripts as well, references from other scripts to be able to get items. So anything over 300 lines of code is going to be included and talked about in a bit more detail and shown. So the first thing you can see on the screen is our 320 lines of code, the day-night cycle. So the day-night cycle also had a more complex system with the fear effect, which would allow that would force the player to have to go on land at certain amounts of time. The nighttime cycle was very, very important because it still meant that it limited the amount that the player could see. So what you're seeing on screen is how it worked. So I would control a tin, a specific color, or a sprite that's over the screen where the player is, have a mask over just around the player, and then change the size of the mask and the color of what the sprite over the character actually was. And this script also controlled the time of day. So we basically calculated how many seconds, minutes, and hours there were, and depending on what time it was, it would change. It would trigger a certain cycle. All this is doing is just changing different colors of sprites, and effectively, when we get down here to the ability go to sleep, when we get to an island, we could go to sleep and this would all activate. Of course, we have the save function and the load function for the time of day. The next thing we're going to talk about is the crafting pool, or essentially the crafting system. This is 385 lines of code. It was a very interesting system actually, because I'd never worked on a crafting system yet, and this was the first time I was doing it. And the way this works is that we're just controlling a bunch of game objects and deactivating and activating them when we need them, as well as essentially just a timer. So when a button is specifically clicked, a timer would play, and when that timer is finished, it would spawn a specific food ball in the world. The player could then pick it up and it would add it to the player score script, which is keeping track of all of our score. And all of our items and integers. Certain animations would play based on what point it's at and what is true or false, and we'd also have some sound playing, so sound was a lot of fun with this one. And of course, if we had a specific upgrade like extra food 1 or extra food 2, where which are the skills in the skill tree, if we'd unlocked those in the crafting section, then it would upgrade it to be able to drop more, or maybe even get a skill point every time you craft or something like that. Of course, these were controlled in their own functions, which were called when a specific crafting was activated. And if they had enough, obviously you need different items to be able to craft. So you need things like crab or bluefish, or maybe you needed something like a green fish. Maybe even for some of the more advanced stuff, you'd need like squid. And of course, these would spawn in different locations in the map, so you would actually have to go and hunt for them and collect them. Of course, you have the hover over function, where you can hover over a specific button and it would change the information. And I also did that in my most recent Dungeon Farm Tycoon, because I find that it's really effective. So that is the crafting. Now next we have the 4 scripts that are the skill tree. So we have I believe it's survival, explore, home, and crafting. Now I won't go into too many details on every single one because they're very similar to each other. However, I will show off one specifically. The one I'm going to actually show is the 4th set, which is the crafting. The reason I'm going to show the 4th set off is because it actually was introduced a lot later. I believe it was in the combat update when it was introduced, when I introduced the food balls and the crafting system. Here we have our script, and in total it was 846 lines of code for this skill tree. The others were roughly about the same, which is 798 to 797. But they're all relatively similar, so I'll quickly go over the 4th one, which has the most. Essentially, what we'd have is getting all of these integers and text and information, and the bools, which will all be controlling what is unlocked and when it's unlocked. Then we have in the update function the actual bools, which control if something has been unlocked or if they have enough items for it. So if they've not actually bought something yet, they would then check to see if they've got the skill requirement, and the skill requirement is determined by how many points they have and have gained over time. So not just what they have on them currently, but also what they've had in total. If they have earned enough and they haven't unlocked it, essentially haven't bought it and unlocked it yet, then a certain like image will be available and the button will be available to be interactable. Once that's hit, then the situation changes, the bool changes. If that is the case, then it will switch over to not being bought, still false, and what will happen is it will wait until the certain requirements has been hit. It'll still check if it's false for the unlock, and it will allow the button, the skill points and everything to be there until it's clicked. Once it's clicked and it's set to true, then it changes. The icon will then become visible, so the and you'll also get like a frame color change, which will determine if it's actually been unlocked. Hopefully you've seen it on screen. And then of course the button will turn false, so you can't click it again. Whatever the skill actually does, it goes into another script. It triggers a different function in another script. In this case it would be the craft skills script. This is very much the same for all of the rest of the script, all the way up to the last skill point. In total I believe there are 40 skills. Now that's a lot of skills. At launch I don't think there was anywhere near as much, maybe 30, maybe less. But I added more as I went, and then when I got to the combat update, which was a huge update, I ended up introducing a ton of new skill points, and new skills and even abilities, which we'll talk about now actually. So I also introduced those 3 abilities, which was the bite, the boost and the teleport. These were just situational. I believe they were in the survival skill tree, and I believe the teleporting home was maybe the home one. Survival was just as it sounds, it was to keep the player alive, so things like shields, being able to bite, to be able to essentially kill enemies, and to be able to survive more in the environment was what the survival was all about. Then you had the explore, and I believe the explore was things like a lore finder, mini-maps, a beacon for your home, teleport. The home one was actually one of my favourite to work on, which was essentially upgrading your own home, so you could be able to create your own little pool, which would spawn fish over time and food over time. You also had a sleeping bed island, a little island where you could sleep and skip the night. You had a storage island, which increased your overall storage of how much you could hold. And as I mentioned earlier, the final one was the crafting skill line, which I'm not going to talk about again. So once you had bought it, it would, as I mentioned, it would determine, it would take away some of your skill points that you had based on what it would require, and then you would buy it. Next is the objectives. Now the objectives are quite extensive because there were so many. I believe there was something like 27, maybe more, maybe just underneath. I can't remember, but there was quite a lot of objectives that you had to do in order to complete the game. Once you got to a certain amount of objectives, the boss fight would unlock, and you could then go in the boss fight and complete the game. But you had to be able to do that. Of course, this objective system was kind of the way to push the players forward. You also got rewards for completing objectives, and this was basically either skill points or food or something like that. You would get those rewards for completing them, so it was worth doing. You could track your objectives in the UI and see which ones you'd completed, and it was really effective and useful for the player finding them. Obviously you also got a achievement notification, which I really liked to be. I really enjoyed doing that. It was really fun to do, and I might even do that in my Dungeon Farm Tycoon, just to keep the player going and know what they're doing and feel accomplished as they're playing. Of course, these had little information, a description of what they need to do, as well as kind of like a little fun little title, and a certain amount of skill points, as I mentioned, would be rewarded as a reward. It's really just bools and counting integers, and if they'd hit the certain amount, or if a bool would be true, it would activate the animation for the card. It would change the information for the name and description of your achievement, as well as trigger a objectives complete integer, which would be sent and updated in the player score. Ideally, the ability to then do the boss fight once they have enough. So really simple, straightforward code. Same thing, you were able to hover over individual objectives to see what you could interact with. Moving on, we had the lore book. Now the lore book script is one of my favorite scripts in the entire game. So during the development of the lore books, which is the only way to really understand the story, is you would actually have to go into your UI and read the lore books that you discover. So in the world there are these objects which are the lore books, which look like statues. You'd pick them up and it would basically activate a bool to set as true, so it would check a lore book that has been discovered, and that would appear then in your logs, in your lore book logs, and you would be able to then click on that lore book and see information about the world. These lore books explained, like I said, the world. However, a lot of players don't like reading. I personally don't like reading a lot unless it's really intuitive. So I don't like reading a bunch of text on my screen, so I added the option of audio. So the player has the option to just play the audio logbook, the logs, and be able to just listen while they're playing, and that was a really nice feature. And I did my best to try and make it sound like a radio that has been recorded. Now, a quick mention that I actually forgot to mention how many lines of code the objectives was. That was 918, and the lore books, the lore script was actually 658. So this has been ProTaleDev, and I'll see you next time.